What is acceptable use of force? This is a tough one, and it's important to preface this with every use of force situation is going to be different. The use of force for you as a private citizen versus somebody in the military versus somebody in law enforcement or security is going to vary. The guidelines, the parameters, the rules of engagement, so on and so forth, it gets kind of muddled. But let's talk about you as a citizen. What is a acceptable use of force? The first thing that I want to discuss is the reasonable articulable suspicion. That those are a lot of words. What does that mean? It means that you need to be able, when all the dust is settled, when you are sitting in front of a jury of your peers, to be able to articulate or to explain why you used that level of force to stop a threat. Now, what are some general guidelines? Understanding that all of our states are convoluted, our legal system is very convoluted. States have different parameters and guidelines for escalation and use of deadly force. What are some general guidelines? Now, let me back this up by saying I'm not an attorney. I have spent a significant amount of time going through use of force training, going through the legal system. So these are based off of my experience, some general guidelines that I would say might help build a foundation. There's a lot more to this, but this is the basics. Acceptable use of force would be the minimum amount of force necessary to make an apprehension or to stop a threat. You want to use the minimum amount of force necessary to stop that threat. Now, understanding there are tons of different circumstances. You can be by yourself, you can be with your kids, and all of those factors there are mitigating and ex- and exacerbating circumstances. There's another term for it, but there's aggravating circumstances as well, whether or aggravating factors that can either bode more well for you in a court of law or they can make you look pretty bad. So understanding that also, a duty to retreat. It's important to know your local laws or whether or not you have a duty to retreat, whether you are required to attempt to flee or whether you have something that is called stand your ground, where you do not have to flee if you are in fear for your safety. And fear for your safety is a very broad term. Now, are you in fear for your safety that you're going to get yelled at and accosted? Attempt to walk away. It's always best to attempt to avoid a confrontation if possible. If somebody comes in and they're starting to shoot, say you're in a gas station, somebody comes in and they start shooting. Is it acceptable to return fire? I would say, depending on the circumstances, as long as you have a clear line of sight, you understand your backdrop, you have the right target, or you have the right firearm and ammunition to match the target, potentially yes. Now, there are other things. There are people running out. There are multiple people in your line of sight. There could be a high risk for collateral damage. You have the back door right next to you where you could just exit. That's where that duty to retreat or your stand your ground comes into play. The acceptable use of force is being able to have that reasonable articulable suspicion that somebody was going to enact a felony upon your person, being robbery, be it a burglary, be it a murder, be it something, an unwanted touching in advance of that primarily would pertain to the ladies, is unfortunate as that is. Um, Having that reasonable articulable suspicion that you needed to use that lethal force to stop that threat. Now, there are different types of de-escalation techniques. There's verbal judo where you try and talk people down, you try and use your words, you try and put barriers in between you and somebody else to try and find your way out of the situation, to try to escape as best you can. But at the very last thing, if you can escape no further, there you the hair on the back of your neck is standing up. You've got multiple attackers advancing upon yourself. You have to explain the drawing, the presenting of that weapon. Why did you draw? Why did you present that weapon? Was that acceptable? Was it reasonable? Now, you are going to have to explain this. Your attorney is going to have to explain this. Hopefully, you don't get a public defender. Spend the money, get an attorney. Hopefully, your attorney can explain the reasonable suspicion. Then it's up to the jury to understand, based off of the information that you've given, surveillance camera footage, and the totality of the circumstance, for you to paint the full picture why you use that force. The acceptable use of force is always going to come down to something like, was the force reasonable? If somebody yelled at you when you pulled out your 9mm and shot him in the face, is that reasonable? No, that is most likely not going to be reasonable, and you're going to spend a significant amount of the rest of your life in prison. Now, if somebody is advancing on you with a weapon, if somebody has struck you and it is continuing to advance upon you with a weapon, that might be reasonable force or reasonable articulable suspicion for the use of deadly force. There are things like that. Now, don't be so cavalier about using force. It is a very stressful, very strenuous process. If you go into a use of force scenario as any law enforcement, military, whatever the case may be, civilian, especially as a civilian, because you have to deal with the criminal justice. You have to deal with that criminal justice aspect. You have to deal with the civil litigation. You have to deal with the criminal litigation. You have to deal with the potential liabilities. It is a minefield that you're walking into. Now, ultimately, it comes up to, what do you think is the best thing for your family and for your community? If you have the training, if you have the knowledge, skills, and abilities, and right mindset, the understanding of how the tactical situation works, how the firearm works, how to de-escalate, how to talk to law enforcement, which in general cases I would say do not speak to law enforcement following a use of force scenario. Speak to your attorney. Make no statements until you speak with your attorney. That's just the general guideline that I would suggest, because you are not in a position to speak to law enforcement after a use of force scenario. When you watch police body cameras, after they get into a shooting, what is the first thing they do? They shut up. They isolate them from the situation. They move them over to a car because they need to consult with an attorney. Please understand this is critical, and it can be the difference between incriminating yourself, saying the wrong thing, or potentially being free. It's a very, very big deal. Don't make any statements to law enforcement until you speak to your attorney. Always have an attorney lined up. It may not be the most easy thing to do. Have several attorneys that you speak to. Make sure they're criminal defense attorneys. You don't want to have a real estate attorney trying to represent you in a criminal trial. It's probably not going to work out for you. Like, oh, I've got this guy from business law. Let me have him in my criminal trial. It may not work out well for you. So just make sure that you're sourcing your attorney correctly. Vet your attorneys. Hopefully this has been helpful and insightful. Have a great day.